So, imagine getting arrested for a DUI, right? But you're fast asleep, parked in a completely empty lot, and the engine is totally off.
Right.
Like, the keys aren't even in the ignition. They're just sitting in the cup holder so you can, grab them to turn the heat on if the temperature drops too low.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but
It's terrifying.
yeah.
But in Connecticut, if you're unhoused and just trying to survive a freezing night in your car, that is a very real legal trap.
Oh, absolutely.
So welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Surviving homelessness is, well, it's a totally different game, depending on which state line you cross. What might be a manageable setback in one state could easily become a permanent, inescapable trap in another.
Yeah, exactly.
Our mission today is to build the perfectly homeless state scorecard for Connecticut, and we're doing it in real time. We're going to evaluate exactly how this state treats its residents without housing, looking at the lived reality and the systems they have in place.
And just so you know, that score is going to evolve dynamically as we talk.
Right, so we won't reveal the final grade until the very end of the conversation.
Right. And to do this properly, we really have to ground ourselves in the data. We have a massive stack of sources today.
A huge stack, yeah.
We're pulling from the 2026 point-in-time census data, local zoning ordinances, some highly contested legislative testimonies, and deep policy papers. And looking at the sheer scale of the issue in Connecticut right now, it's troubling.
Yeah, the numbers are rough.
According to the latest census, homelessness has risen for 5 consecutive years. On a single night in January of 2026, there were 3,847 people experiencing homelessness across the state.
Wow.
But what really stands out to me isn't just that total number. It's who is actually falling into this crisis. It's not just chronically unhoused folks. We've seen a staggering 51% increase since 2024 in seniors like people 65 and older suddenly finding themselves without a home.
Wait, I want to pause right there because a 50% increase for seniors in just a couple of years, that's an absolute systemic
It
failure.
really is.
What is the mechanism driving that specific demographic out of their homes? I mean, seniors are typically the most residentially stable demographic in the country.
Well, it comes down to a major geographic and economic pattern that basically defines Connecticut. The state is characterized by this stark divergence between extreme municipal wealth on one hand and severe housing deprivation on the other.
Right, the gap is massive.
Think about seniors living on fixed incomes,
Right.
Social Security or a modest pension. Their income is totally static,
Mm.
but they're living in a market where housing costs are just accelerating at an unprecedented rate.
They literally can't keep up.
Exactly. They cannot absorb these double-digit rent increases, so they hit a mathematical wall, they drain whatever small savings they have left, and then they lose their housing.
That tension between extreme wealth and severe deprivation is really the perfect entry point for our scorecard. Because to understand how this reality is actually lived by people every day, we have to look at the root cause, right?
Right.
If you can't afford a place to live, literally nothing else matters. So let's start by looking at our first category, housing affordability.
Yeah, and the real conditions in Connecticut's housing market are genuinely staggering. Since 2020, home values have jumped 59%.
Wow.
59. Yeah, which ranks as the third fastest appreciation rate in the entire country. And at the same time, rents have spiked by 35%.
That's just unsustainable.
Totally. And the reason prices are skyrocketing is a profound lack of supply. Housing production has completely plummeted. Like, if you look back at the 1980s, Connecticut was building about 14,000 new housing units every single year. By the 2010s, that dropped to just 4,000 units a year.
I'm looking at this drop from 14,000 down to 4,000. You don't just lose 10,000 units of housing production annually by accident.
No, you definitely don't.
There has to be a mechanism choking off that supply. What is actually stopping developers from building?
Well, it's extreme localized control. Connecticut doesn't have a strong county government system. Instead, it relies on 169 individual towns.
Right.
And the state gives almost all zoning authority directly to those individual towns. And towns use that authority to protect their local property values and maintain specific neighborhood demographics.
So they just block everything.
Basically, yeah. They implement huge minimum lot sizes, they outright prohibit multifamily apartment complexes, and they create approval processes so long and expensive that developers simply give up.
Unbelievable.
They incentivize massive single-family homes and effectively block the smaller, affordable projects that low-income households desperately need.
So instead of a unified state housing policy, it's like a highway with a severe bottleneck, right? where 169 different toll booth operators each get to decide who is allowed to pass.
That's a great way to put it.
And most of them have just decided to keep their gates permanently closed. And the lived reality of that restricted supply is devastating. Even people who are working full-time literally cannot keep up.
No, they really can't.
The data from our sources shows the average income for a working homeless individual in Connecticut is around $1,800 a month. But to actually survive in this market, the minimum living wage needed ranges from $4,000 for a single person up to $12,000 a month for a family.
Right.
Which really makes me push back on that common national narrative we always hear, that homelessness is purely an addiction or a mental health issue. Because in CT, the data proves it's just a simple math problem. Expenses dramatically exceed income.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, 63% of emergency shelter clients cite income and affordability as the primary cause of their homelessness. Mental health and substance abuse each account for less than 10%.
Less than 10%. Wow.
Yeah, that is a crucial distinction. The macroeconomics are the primary driver here. It's structural. The housing simply does not exist for the people at the bottom of the income ladder.
Right. Well, based on this severe affordability crisis, this lowers the overall picture right out of the gate. Our starting draft score for Connecticut is extremely low. And because these residents are mathematically priced out of the housing market, they have no choice but to seek emergency refuge.
Which means they are funneled directly into the state's shelter system.
Exactly. So let's look at Category 2, shelter access.
Right. And when we look at the real conditions and policy here, the first thing you need to know is that Connecticut is not a right to shelter state.
Meaning the government has absolutely no legal obligation to provide emergency housing to displaced residents.
Exactly. Unlike places like New York or Massachusetts, if there are no beds available in Connecticut, the state isn't legally required to find you one or pay for a hotel.
That's brutal.
It is. Now, to their credit, they do manage to shelter a significant number of people. Over 3,400 individuals were sheltered in 2026, and they do utilize a severe cold weather protocol.
Okay, so what does that look like?
When temperatures drop to dangerous levels, the state activates a coordinated response to rapidly add emergency overflow beds and distribute motel vouchers so people don't literally freeze to death.
But the mechanics of that system are completely bottlenecked, right? I mean, emergency shelters are designed to be temporary triage centers. You stay a few weeks, stabilize, and move on.
Ideally, yeah.
But our longitudinal data shows that 348 people from the 2025 census were still stuck in those exact same emergency shelters a full year later in 2026.
Yeah, and that bottleneck happens entirely because of the housing affordability crisis we just talked about.
Yeah.
If there are no affordable apartments to move into, people cannot exit the shelter.
So they just stay.
Right. The emergency beds become permanent residences by default, and the system gets completely saturated.
So what happens to you when the shelter doors are locked, all the beds are taken by people who can't leave, and it drops below freezing outside? Where do people physically go?
That is the daily crisis on the ground. People end up seeking warmth in 24-hour transit hubs, setting up tents in the woods or sleeping in their vehicles. The cold weather protocol is a strong safety net when it's officially activated, but that permanent bottleneck severely limits everyday access to a bed.
Well, this shifts the score slightly because they do have that cold weather protocol, but the lack of guaranteed access really drags it down. Based on this, the current draft score is... Well, actually, let's pause right here for a second.
Okay.
We're going to put up a preliminary score overlay on the screen right now. If you're keeping track with us, right now the draft score for Connecticut is hovering in the dismal D range.
Which is pretty grim.
Yeah, but do not write that down in pen just yet. I want to emphasize that this is not the final score. The upcoming legal and enforcement categories could significantly change where we end up.
Right, because the moment you're turned away from a full shelter and forced onto the street, you immediately collide with local laws designed to basically manage your existence.
Which brings us to Category 3, criminalization and enforcement. When you don't have a private space to exist, every private thing you do, sleeping, eating, sitting, becomes a public act.
And the policy landscape surrounding those public acts is incredibly tense. In 2026, there was this fierce legislative battle over House Bill 5260. And we need to look at both sides of this objectively because it gets to the core of how society handles extreme poverty.
Right, we're not taking sides here, just looking at the arguments. So what did the advocates want?
On one side, civil rights advocates want to decriminalize what they call activities of daily living. Their argument is that punishing unhoused people for sleeping on a bench, eating in public, or occupying legally parked cars violates basic human rights.
Because they literally have nowhere else to go.
Exactly. They argue it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment.
But the towns are fighting back hard against that.
Very hard. The Connecticut Conference of Municipalities strongly opposed the bill. They view it as a massive state-level overreach. Their argument is that municipalities need local enforcement tools to maintain public safety and sanitation.
Right.
They fear that if they can't enforce anti-camping ordinances, it'll lead to large, unregulated encampments, which they say create public health hazards and destroy local business districts.
So that's the intense policy debate happening in the State House, but what is the lived reality for someone actually on the ground while these municipal laws are being enforced?
The reality is profound legal precarity. The legislative testimonies from our sources are full of examples. Take the story of Kelvin McCullough. He lived in his car for a year, driving between Hartford, Waterbury, and New Haven, desperately searching for steady work.
Okay.
And he was eventually arrested and charged with criminal trespass.
For what? Where was he even parked?
He was parked on the property of an emergency shelter. He parked there because he knew the shelter was full, but he thought the parking lot would be the one place he might be safe from being ticketed by police on the public streets. Instead, he was arrested.
Oh, wow. It's an absolute paradox, isn't it? These municipalities complain about unhoused people being visible on Main Street, but simultaneously, they use residential parking permits and strict 2 a.m. curfews to ensure these folks have nowhere legal to exist out of sight.
Exactly.
You can't sleep on the park bench because of an anti-camping ordinance, but you also can't park your car on a quiet side street because of a permit law. Where are you supposed to evaporate to?
You can't.
Well, this lowers the overall picture significantly. Our draft score just took another major hit. And that paradox where sidewalks and parks are heavily policed means that many people turn to the one piece of private property they have left, their vehicles.
Which brings us right into Category 4, vehicle dwelling friendliness. And if you are relying on a car for survival, Connecticut's geography and laws are incredibly hostile.
Let's break down the geography first. Because out west, you can just drive onto public land, right?
Yeah, out west, you have millions of acres of Bureau of Land Management land or national forests where dispersed camping is perfectly legal. You can boondock for weeks.
Right.
Connecticut has absolutely none of that. There is no legal public land for vehicle dwelling, so you're entirely dependent on paved infrastructure.
Like highway rest areas.
Well, they technically allow overnight parking, but the state policy strictly says it's only for drowsy drivers to rest temporarily. State police actively patrol these areas to prevent anything resembling camping.
So no window shades.
Exactly. If you set up a screen to block the streetlights, or if your car is there for too long, an officer will tap on your window and tell you to move along.
What about commercial lots? I mean, it used to be an unwritten rule that you could always park at a Walmart for the night.
That landscape is changing rapidly. Commercial lots like Walmart, Biz Pro shops, and large grocery chains are increasingly banning overnight parking. They're installing prohibitive signage, hiring private security, towing vehicles. It's getting tough.
But the most terrifying legal trap for vehicle dwellers in CT, and this goes back to the hook of the show, is the loophole within the state's DUI laws. Let's dig into the mechanics of this because it sounds absurd on its face. How does a person who is fast asleep get charged with a DUI?
The legal standard for a DUI in Connecticut does not require you to be actively driving the vehicle. The law is based on a concept called actual physical control.
Okay.
Originally, this was meant to stop drunk drivers who pulled over but might wake up and decide to drive again. But when applied to someone who literally lives in their vehicle, it becomes a devastating trap.
So how does it trigger?
If an unhoused person is sleeping in the driver's seat, maybe because it's the only seat that reclines, and the keys are accessible anywhere in the cabin, they can be arrested. Yeah. Maybe you put the keys in the ignition just to turn on the battery to charge your phone, or run the heater so you don't freeze to death. To an officer, that constitutes actual physical control. You get a DUI without ever putting the car in drive.
Just for trying to survive a freezing night in a parked car, it's like navigating a legal minefield.
Yeah.
You're dodging zoning laws, state police at rest stops, and DUI charges just for trying to stay warm.
It's exhausting.
And despite all this targeted hostility, vehicles are a vital lifeline. Look at Melissa Julotska's story from the testimonies we reviewed. Sleeping in their car wasn't some romantic van life choice.
No, not at all.
It meant literal safety and physical distance from a domestic abuser. Her car was her sanctuary. It had locked doors and mobility.
And treating that sanctuary as a criminal offense pushes vulnerable people even further to the margins. When you impound someone's car, you are essentially destroying their home and their ability to get to work in one fell swoop.
This lowers the overall picture even further. The draft score is really taking a beating here. With no legal place to park or sleep, an unhoused person's only hope is getting pulled out of this crisis by the state system itself.
Right, they need intervention.
So let's look at Category 5, outreach and social services.
Now, this is an area where Connecticut actually shines. Their systemic organization is incredibly robust. The state operates 8 Coordinated Access Networks, or CANs.
Okay, how do those work?
It's a highly centralized system. To enter the network, an individual simply dials 211. And just to give you an idea of the volume, in a single year, that hotline logged over 73,000 housing assistance calls.
73,000, that's massive.
Yeah. From there, individuals are screened by specialists, assessed for vulnerability, and placed on a centralized statewide by-name list.
I have to say that is deeply impressive. The state is utilizing a centralized tech approach, using the homeless management information system and a mobile app called Engage.
Yeah, the tech is really integrated.
Yeah. They're literally tracking people by their actual names, mapping their last known locations, updating medical needs in real time. You don't fall through the cracks nearly as easily if the entire state system knows exactly who you are.
Absolutely. It takes people from being nameless statistics to known individuals with specific case files. And the lived reality of this outreach is highly proactive.
Like what?
For example, the state deploys SLR caseworkers. SLR stands for SSDI Outreach, Access, and Recovery. If you're sleeping under a bridge trying to gather medical records and fill out complex federal forms to prove you have a disability is nearly impossible.
Yeah, the red tape is insane.
So these caseworkers are specialized navigators who know exactly how to cut through that tape to get these folks the disability income they are legally entitled to. The DOT even sends specialized clinicians directly to transit hubs to engage people right where they are.
But given the sheer volume of 73,000 calls, there have to be bottlenecks in this outreach, right?
There are. Capacity remains the primary issue. The system is incredibly well designed, but it just gets overwhelmed. For example, the state launched the HERO program, which provides housing and intensive outreach for folks with severe opioid use disorders.
Okay.
But it was so heavily utilized that it completely maxed out its waitlist and had to stop accepting new pre-screeners entirely.
So the infrastructure is brilliantly designed, but the volume is just too high to process everyone immediately. Still, this raises the overall picture significantly. We are updating the draft score to reflect this really strong systemic effort.
It is a strong effort.
But of course, outreach is really only as good as the housing it leads to. An outreach worker can't fix your situation if they don't have a set of keys to hand you. Which brings us to our final category, pathways to permanent housing.
When we look at policy here, Connecticut has made a massive, sustained financial effort. Since 2016, the number of rapid rehousing beds, which provide short-term rental assistance, has increased by an astonishing 136%. And permanent supportive housing beds, which combine housing with long-term care, have increased by 30%. The state is actively building the exit ramps out of homelessness and funding them aggressively.
But let's look at the mechanics of how those exit ramps actually work. What is the lived reality for someone who finally makes it to the top of that by name list and is handed a voucher today?
The reality is that the voucher system is incredibly fragile right now. Housing vouchers are capped by something called fair market rent, which is a calculation set by the federal government based on average local prices.
Right.
But because real-world market rents in CT are rising so aggressively, those state vouchers simply don't stretch as far as they used to. A provider might have the voucher funding in hand, but they literally cannot find a landlord with an apartment priced low enough to legally use it.
So the money is there, but the market has outpaced the legal limits of the subsidy.
Precisely. Furthermore, the entire system relies heavily on federal funding, which makes it precarious. A recent federal policy shift from HUD threatened to slash continuum of care funding, which is the primary block grant for these programs.
That sounds dangerous.
Very. If that policy shift had gone through, it would have cut funding that currently supports 6,000 formerly unhoused Connecticut residents. It literally would have tripled the state's homeless population overnight.
Wow. So to synthesize this, Connecticut is essentially bailing water out of a boat using a highly engineered, incredibly efficient pump system.
Right.
They are successfully housing thousands of people and funding permanent beds. But the systemic unaffordability of the state's housing market is letting water in faster than the pumps can handle.
That perfectly captures the dynamic. The permanent housing infrastructure is working at maximum capacity, but the broader macroeconomic pressures are constantly overwhelming it.
Based on this, the current draft score stabilizes. The state is trying incredibly hard and putting real money behind the solutions, but the economic headwinds are just too fierce.
Yeah. If we pull back and look at the final summary of Connecticut's landscape, the major strengths and weaknesses are very clearly defined. The state's major strength is undoubtedly its highly coordinated, tech-driven outreach system through the CAN networks, combined with its massive financial investment in permanent supportive housing beds.
And the major weaknesses.
A catastrophic lack of affordable housing caused directly by highly restrictive, localized zoning laws, coupled with aggressive town-by-town criminalization of poverty and absolutely zero safe parking infrastructure for the growing number of vehicle dwellers.
All right, we have evaluated the systems, the laws, and the lived reality. It is time to assign the final grades for our scorecard. For housing affordability, Connecticut gets an F.
Makes sense.
Shelter access grade. C,
Yeah.
criminalization and enforcement grade. D, vehicle dwelling friendliness grade. F, outreach and social services grade, A-. And pathways to permanent housing grade, B. Which brings us to the final perfectly homeless state score for Connecticut. Factoring in the life-saving outreach and permanent housing investments against the brutal economic realities and hostile local ordinances, Connecticut earns a cumulative score of a C-.
Yeah. I'd say Connecticut has the social safety net and the technology to try and save you, but its underlying economy and its local municipal laws are actively trying to push you out.
Absolutely. And before we wrap, here's a thought for you to walk away with. We talked about that 50% spike in seniors falling into homelessness. Think about what happens when those seniors inevitably need a home health aid or physical therapy or daily medication deliveries. How does the healthcare system service a senior who no longer has a fixed address? The shadow cost of this housing crisis is eventually going to bankrupt the healthcare system. That's the perfectly homeless state score for Connecticut. But here's the bigger question. Would you survive homelessness in the state? Let me know in the comments, and if there's a state you'd like to see next, tell me below. This is a 50-state journey through how America actually treats people without housing, and every state tells a different story. If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a PH hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next state.